the colony world of New Carthage, had been alive 11 days ago. Vrethkon remembered seeing its file once, a pale amber planet orbiting a warm orange star, home to 2.1 million humans who grew grain, raised children, and apparently had a university choir that had just won some intercolonial singing competition. He hadn't paid it much attention at the time. Humans were always winning something, always celebrating something, always making noise about something. Now there was nothing left to make noise about. His shuttle drifted through the debris field in silence. His sensors swept the wreckage with the patient indifference of good technology, cataloging fragments of vitrified rock still glowing faintly at their edges, shattered orbital infrastructure, the frozen cascade of what had once been an atmosphere. The Vreth Dominion's planetary denial weapon, what humans would later call a glasser, had done its work in approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes to turn a living world into a monument to nothing. Vrethkon was 400 years old. He had seen dead worlds before. This one felt different, and he was professional enough to distrust that feeling. He opened his Ansible channel to file his preliminary report to the compact. The words came easily, they always did when you had written enough reports. Incident confirmed. Colonial population, total loss. Perpetrating force, Vreth Dominion, 3rd Expansion Fleet. Compact recommendation, emergency diplomatic session, formal censure, possible sanctions review, clean, measured, appropriate. He closed the channel and sat in the quiet of his shuttle for a moment longer. What was bothering him, he realized, was not the debris field. It was not even the scale of the atrocity, as enormous as it was. What was bothering him was the human response channel that had been open on his secondary display for the last 9 hours. It was silent. Not quiet in the way a diplomatic channel goes quiet when bureaucrats are drafting careful language. Not silent in the way grief looks when it's performing itself for cameras. This was something else entirely, a deep, total, organized silence, as if 200 billion humans had simultaneously decided to stop talking. In his 4 centuries of diplomatic service, Vrethkon had dealt with hundreds of species in crisis. When the Kethmarali lost a colony to a stellar event, they wailed for months across every broadcast frequency. When the Dominion itself had lost a fleet outpost to a rogue faction 30 years ago, they threatened destruction for weeks before accepting mediation. Humans had lost 2.1 million people in 4 minutes. And they had nothing to say. He flagged the observation in a footnote to his report, unusual communications silence from Earth government, likely processing period before formal diplomatic response, and moved on. He was thorough enough to note it. He was not wise enough to understand it. His shuttle began the long journey back to the compact relay station, threading through the asteroid belt that had once been New Carthage's outer moon, shattered now, another casualty. Through the viewport, the debris caught the light of the orange star and glittered like something almost beautiful. Vrethkon watched it for a long time. He thought about the choir. He didn't know why. He hadn't even listened to them. But something about that detail, children, singing, winning a prize, being proud, being alive, kept returning to him as his shuttle climbed away from the grave of a world. 9 days later, every human ambassador in the galaxy simultaneously submitted their resignation and booked transport home. Vrethkon read the news and felt the first real stirring of something he hadn't experienced in over a century. Fear. He went back to his preliminary report and stared at that footnote for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in 40 years of diplomatic service. He rewrote his recommendation entirely. He used words like urgent and unprecedented, and the compact must act immediately. He filed it. By the time it reached the right desks, it was already far too late. The silence from Earth lasted exactly 11 days. What came after the silence was not screaming. It was not demands. It was the sound of an entire civilization quietly, methodically, converting itself into something that had no peacetime use whatsoever. Yale Torres had attended a lot of parliamentary sessions in her 30-year career, and she had learned to read the room before anyone spoke a word. The room today said, "We have already decided." She stood in the observation gallery above the parliamentary floor and watched the delegates from Earth's 43 colony worlds file into their seats. They were quiet. That was the first thing you noticed. Parliamentary sessions were normally a rolling thunder of side conversations, procedural squabbles, and the particular aggressive shuffling of people who disagreed about everything. Today they filed in like people walking into a funeral, except with a very specific, very cold kind of purpose that funerals didn't usually carry. The war mandate passed 94.7% in favor. Tors had been expecting something in the high 80s. She looked at that number for a moment and felt it settle into her chest like a stone. The speaker asked her to say a few words. Tors was not a woman given to speeches. She had built her career on the philosophy that if you needed more than one sentence to give an order, you hadn't thought it through properly. She walked to the podium, looked out at 3,000 delegates representing the full breadth of human civilization, and said what she had been thinking about for 11 days. New Carthage was a farming world. They had a university, 4 hospitals, and a children's choir that had just won the Intercolonial Festival. She paused for exactly one breath. We will remember every name. She walked back to her seat. The chamber erupted not in cheers, which surprised observers from other species who watched the broadcast later, in something quieter and more frightening. A long, sustained sound that a compact linguist would later spend an entire academic paper trying to describe, eventually settling on the phrase collective affirmation of terrible purpose. Tors didn't stay for the rest of the session. She had work to do. The work looked like spreadsheets, which she found grimly appropriate. 43 colony worlds, 12 orbital manufacturing platforms, 237 registered civilian shipyards, all of which had received new construction codes that morning reclassifying their output under a single designation that hadn't been used since the intercolonial conflicts of the 22nd century. War material. She walked the floors of the Mars shipyards that evening with her chief engineer, a woman named Beatrice who communicated primarily through sighs of varying emotional complexity. The civilian freighters were already being stripped to their frames. Ore processors were being unbolted from their housings and moved to the weapons fabrication queue. 1,000 workers moved through the vast pressurized cavern in near silence, and Tors watched them and thought about something her history professor had once told her. That the most dangerous moment in any conflict was not when the stronger party struck first. It was when the stronger party noticed they were stronger. Humanity had been so busy building colonies and universities and children's choirs that it had somewhat lost track of what it was capable of when it stopped doing those things. Tors stood at the railing above the shipyard floor and watched the numbers climb on her tablet. Production capacity, conversion rates, fleet readiness timelines, every figure was higher than the last projections. People were working double shifts without being asked. The labor unions, who had fought the defense ministry tooth and nail over contracts for 2 decades, had issued a joint statement that morning waiving all overtime disputes until further notice. 2.1 million names. Tors closed her tablet and looked at the stars through the viewport above the shipyard. New Carthage's star was out there somewhere, still burning orange and indifferent over a field of debris. She made herself a single promise. Standing there in the noise and heat of a civilization, converting itself into something ancient and terrible. Every single one of those names would be spoken aloud before this was over, by someone who had done what needed doing, in a place that mattered. She didn't know yet who, she didn't know yet where. She went back to her spreadsheets. 48 hours later, the Vreth Dominion's intelligence service intercepted the new fleet production codes and ran their analysis. Their chief analyst looked at the output numbers, cross-referenced them against known human industrial capacity, and quietly submitted his resignation rather than deliver the report to his superiors. He did not want to be in the room for that conversation. Scarathvel had written the original assessment. He needed to establish that up front, in the resignation letter, because he intended it to function as both a confession and a record, something that might survive what was coming even if he did not. He had written the words manageable species, emotional volatility offset by organizational fragmentation, recommend continued low-intensity pressure 12 years ago, and those words had become the intellectual foundation of every Dominion policy toward humanity since. He had been wrong. He wanted history to know that he knew it. He wrote the letter over 3 sleepless nights at his desk. Surrounded by data his superiors had refused to believe and analysts who kept telling him he was overreacting. He was not overreacting. He had spent 30 years studying humanity. He had read their history, their literature, their military doctrine. He had watched their congressional hearings and their sporting events and their endless, baffling debates about things that seemed to matter enormously to them and very little to anyone else. He had, in 30 years, come to understand one thing about humans with absolute certainty. They were not like other species. He wrote this in the letter and then spent 2 paragraphs explaining exactly what he meant, because he knew his superiors would assume he meant something it didn't mean. He didn't mean humans were physically superior or technologically ahead or strategically smarter. Other species matched them on all those metrics. What he meant was this: humans had already done this before. Not to alien species, to themselves. He pulled up the historical files he had spent a month compiling, wars of the 20th and 21st centuries, before humanity had even left their home solar system. He cited the numbers carefully in the letter, knowing his superiors would think he had made errors. He hadn't. In the span of roughly 100 years, a species that had only just discovered powered flight had industrialized warfare to the point of constructing weapons capable of annihilating their own cities. They had then proceeded to use those weapons. They had rebuilt. They had done it again. They had rebuilt again. They had eventually developed enough collective trauma and institutional memory to stop doing it to each other, but that machinery, that terrible genius for converting civilization into war and war into civilization, had never been dismantled. It had been redirected outward, into ships, into colonies, into expansion. And now something had reached into that expansion and killed 2.1 million people. Scarathvel wrote the words carefully. We have not provoked a military response. We have triggered an immune reaction. There is a critical difference. A military response has objectives, constraints, supply lines, and political endpoints. An immune reaction continues until the threat is gone, completely, without remainder. He documented the production conversion numbers his analyst had resigned rather than present. He documented the timeline. He documented the complete, eerie absence of any diplomatic communication from Earth. No threats, no demands, no ultimatums. Nothing. Just the silence of an organism that had stopped talking because it had decided that talking was no longer the appropriate tool. He ended the letter with 4 words. We have made a mistake. He filed it to the High Command, the Dominion Council, and in what he understood was probably a treasonable act, the Galactic Compact's diplomatic archive, where it would at least be preserved. Then he went home. He sat in his garden. He watched his planet's sun set over the hills and thought about 30 years of misread data and one catastrophically incorrect assessment, and the 2 million people whose deaths had come, in some small part, from his failure to understand what he was looking at. He had thought humans were manageable because they were emotional. He had not understood that for humans, emotion was not a weakness that clouded judgment. It was fuel. The first human fleet did not appear on the Dominion's long-range sensors at any expected military target. It appeared instead at the 3 star systems responsible for supplying 80% of the Dominion's fuel synthesis network, simultaneously, without warning, from vectors that shouldn't have been physically possible given when the fleet was assembled. The Dominion's Defense Command spent 6 minutes trying to understand how before the shooting started. Commander Reza Akafar had been a peacetime officer for most of his career, and he had always believed, in some abstract way, that war would feel different from everything else. It didn't. It felt, at the tactical level, remarkably like a very high-stakes logistics problem. He stood at his command display and watched 3 simultaneous engagements resolve across a front 300 light-years wide, feeding him telemetry in real time through the quantum-linked relay network that had been the Terran Strategic Fleet's single most expensive pre-war procurement decision, and as it turned out, its most important. He could see all 3 engagements at once. His counterparts in the Dominion could barely see one. The targets were not military installations. That had been the first argument in the strategic planning sessions, a long, heated argument that Tors had ended in approximately 90 seconds by pulling up a map and saying, they have 81 active military installations. They have 3 fuel synthesis hubs. Which set of targets ends the war faster? Akafar had been in that room. He remembered the silence that followed. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes simultaneously that the answer they'd been building toward was actually much simpler than they'd been making it. Akafar's flotilla hit the primary hub at Vrethsan, while Commander Diallo's force hit the secondary hub at the edge of Dominion space, and Captain Ewan's smaller, faster strike group threaded through what the Dominion considered an impassable debris belt to reach the tertiary installation behind their own defense lines. All 3 strikes began within a 4-second window of each other. The engagements were not elegant. War rarely was up close. Akafar watched his ships take fire, watched damage reports scroll across his secondary display, watched 3 of his crew get pulled to medical with injuries he'd learned the details of later. He felt each one of those reports like a physical thing. But he kept his attention on the tactical picture because that was his job. And his job right now was to make sure that the Vreth Dominion's capacity to fuel their warships dropped by 80% in the next 40 minutes. 43 minutes after the engagement opened, all 3 installations were offline. Dominion defense fleets arrived at each location minutes too late, finding wreckage and a single repeating Ansible signal broadcasting on every available frequency. The signal was not a demand. It was not a threat assessment. It was not a declaration of war. They were past those. It was a sound file playing on loop, a human voice, very calm, reading a name. Maria Santos, David Kim, Eiko Tanaka, James Okonkwo. The names of New Carthage's dead. All 2.1 million of them, transmitted across the ruins of the Dominion's logistical spine, playing endlessly into the void. Okafor had approved the signal personally. Some of his officers had questioned it, not the sentiment, but the tactical value. He'd told them it wasn't about tactical value. It was about clarity of message. He wanted the Dominion to understand at a fundamental level that this was not a military operation with political objectives and a negotiated endpoint. This was a reckoning. His crew worked in near silence around him. They were good people, not warriors by nature, most of them. Engineers, scientists, navigators who had signed on to explore and build and push the edges of what humanity understood about the universe. They had not signed on for this. But they had not hesitated either. That was the thing about humans that Okafor had spent his career trying to articulate to allied species briefings and never quite finding the right words for. Humans didn't like war. They found it horrible. They wrote poetry about how horrible it was. They built memorials to the people it killed. They passed resolutions and signed treaties and built international institutions specifically designed to prevent it. And then, when it came anyway, they were terrifyingly good at it. He checked his damage reports, confirmed his flotilla's readiness status, and pulled up the next set of targets. The Galactic Compact called an emergency session 48 hours later. The motion on the floor, proposed by 3 Compact members who had significant trade relationships with the Dominion, was whether to intervene in the conflict. Specifically, on the Dominion's behalf. The debate was heated. It lasted 6 hours. What ended it was a single question from a very old diplomat who had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Ulmethari was 912 years old, which meant she had watched more civilizations make catastrophic decisions than she cared to count. And she had developed, over those 9 centuries, a very specific and highly calibrated sense for the moment when a room full of intelligent beings was about to make things dramatically worse. The compact chamber was absolutely saturated with that feeling right now. She let the debate run for 6 hours. This was not indifference. She had learned long ago that intelligent beings needed to hear themselves say the wrong thing out loud before they could recognize it as wrong. So she sat at the head of the great circular chamber and listened to 11 species argue about intervention, and she watched their faces and she thought. The Dominion's allies, 3 compact members with trade agreements and supply chain dependencies, argued loudest. They used the language of galactic stability and precedent and proportional response. They said that humanity was overreacting. They said that the Dominion had perhaps made an error in judgment, but surely the appropriate response was mediation, not industrial-scale retribution. They said that if humanity was allowed to do this, then anyone could do this, and where did that leave the Compact's authority? What they meant, which they were not quite saying out loud, was, "We are frightened of what humanity is showing us is possible, and we would like it to stop." Ulmethari understood that fear. She shared some of it. But she had also been alive long enough to understand that there was a difference between fear that deserved action and fear that deserved examination. When the arguments began to cycle, she could always tell when a debate had consumed all its new material and was simply spinning through reruns. She raised her hand. The chamber went quiet. 9 centuries of authority had its uses. She asked one question. How many of you believe, genuinely, in the most honest part of yourselves, that if the positions were reversed, if humanity had glassified a Vreth world, we would be having this conversation at all? The silence that followed was the most honest thing the chamber had produced all day. She watched it move across the room, the slight shift of posture, the averted eyes, the careful study of desk surfaces that politicians across every species performed when they had been caught in a hypocrisy they could not answer for. The Dominion's trade partners went very still. The species who had lost worlds of their own to Dominion expansionism in past centuries sat up slightly straighter. No one spoke. Ulmethari waited 30 seconds, long enough to make the silence meaningful, not long enough to be cruel, and then said quietly, "I thought as much. The motion for intervention is tabled indefinitely. We will observe." What she did not say in the chamber, but wrote in her private journals that evening, was the rest of what she thought. She had been studying humanity for 200 years. She had watched them build their civilization with the specific, peculiar energy of a species that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times and was somewhat aggressively trying to deserve to exist. They were loud and messy and occasionally baffling. They cared with an intensity that other species found exhausting, about things that had already happened, old grievances, historical debts, the names of the long dead. She had always found that quality inefficient. She was revising that assessment. Several compact members, following the session, quietly opened back-channel communications with Earth, not to negotiate, but to offer something that had no formal diplomatic category. Information, records, archives, the collected history of every world the Vreth Dominion had destroyed, diminished, or absorbed over 2 centuries of expansion. Earth replied with a single request: the complete census records, including names of every victim in those files. Ulmithari read that request and sat alone in her office for a long time. She had not expected that. She approved the transfer personally. Earth received 43 files. The files contained the records of 61 worlds and an aggregate death count that made New Carthage look like a footnote. Fleet Chaplain Dr. Amara Os received the files on the bridge of the EFS Remembrance and spent 1 hour reading through them before she understood what she needed to do. Amara Osai had not been sure, when she accepted the commission as Fleet Chaplain, that the role would mean anything in a war. She understood now that it meant everything. She had spent her first weeks aboard the Remembrance doing the things chaplains do, walking the corridors, sitting with people who couldn't sleep, listening to crew members talk about their families and their fear, and the particular specific guilt of being alive when 2.1 million people weren't. She had held people while they cried. She had sat in silence with people who couldn't cry. She had written more letters to families back home than she wanted to count. But it was the 43 files from the compact archive that clarified her purpose. She read through them over the course of a night, alone in her small office, and what struck her, what kept her awake long after exhaustion should have taken her, was not the scale of the numbers, enormous as they were. It was the specificity of the records. Names, ages, occupations. The compact's archivists had been meticulous, or perhaps just sorrowful, in the way they had preserved these records. She found a file from a world called Gethkara, destroyed by the Dominion 140 years ago, that contained the names of 47 children who had been enrolled in something their species called First Memory School, the compact linguist's best approximation of an education system for very young minds. 47 children. 140 years ago. Nobody had said their names out loud in a very long time. Osai requested access to the ship-wide intercom and took it to the captain, who looked at her for a long moment and then said yes without asking any questions, which was exactly the kind of Captain Osai had hoped she was serving under. The next morning at 600, Osai's voice came over the Remembrance's intercom system, calm and clear. "Good morning, I'm going to read some names. Please continue your work." She started with New Carthage. It took 11 hours. She read every name at a measured pace, not rushing, not performing grief, just speaking each name into the air of the ship as if it mattered that someone had said it. Maria Santos, David Kim, Eiko Tanaka, and on through 2.1 million human beings, while around her the Remembrance continued to function as a warship. Weapons crews reloaded. Navigation officers calculated jump coordinates. Engineers ran diagnostics on the railgun arrays and the shield emitters and the FTL drive. The mess hall served 3 meals. People did their jobs. And every single one of them listened. She knew because the Remembrance had the quietest shift changes she had ever heard. People moved carefully, as if noise would interrupt something important. Nobody played music. The usual background chatter of a warship, the jokes, the complaints, the gossip, was absent. The crew of 1,100 people worked, and they listened, and some of them cried quietly at their stations, and none of them were embarrassed about it. When she finished with New Carthage, after 11 hours and a short rest during which she understood completely that she was not done, she opened the first compact archive file. She read the name of the first world, then she started on the names. She had expected this to be harder. These were not her species, not her history, not her grief to carry. But the names were names, and behind each name was exactly the same thing. A person who had been alive and then wasn't. A person who had at some point been someone's child. The species didn't matter. The century didn't matter. By the third file, crew members who had never encountered any member of those species, who had never been in the same star system, who had nothing in common with those people across any biological or cultural axis, were crying quietly at their stations. Osai reached the end of the third file, and understood something she would later struggle to put into words when journalists asked her about it. Humanity had not come out here only for New Carthage. New Carthage was the trigger, but humanity had, without quite articulating it, come out here for everyone the Dominion had ever erased. Because that was who humans were, underneath all the noise and chaos and frustrating specificity of their civilization. They were the species that could not bear for things to be forgotten. It was, she thought, probably their oldest quality, the one that preceded everything else. While Dr. Osa was still reading, the Dominion High Command made their final and most catastrophic strategic decision. Having failed to stop humanity at the logistical level, having failed to find a military target that mattered, they determined that the correct response was to strike Earth directly. They believed, with the particular confidence of people who have never studied their enemy carefully, that destroying the human homeworld would collapse the war effort. They did not understand that humanity had spent 3 centuries deliberately designing their civilization to have no single critical node. There was no head to cut off. There never had been. Threx Mora had planned this operation for 6 weeks, and he was proud of it. He was not a stupid being. He wanted that understood in whatever record survived this. He had 40 years of military service, 12 major engagements, a distinguished record in the Dominion's eastern campaigns. He had studied humanity's military doctrine as thoroughly as the available intelligence allowed. He had planned this strike with care, identified Sol as the seat of human command authority, and assembled a fleet of sufficient size to breach whatever defense network they had prepared. He had simply been working from the wrong model. His fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system at 300 Earth Standard Time, and in the first 30 seconds, Threx Mora understood that something was wrong. His long-range sensors began cataloging the defense grid, and the numbers didn't match his intelligence projections. He called for a recalibration. The sensors confirmed themselves. He called his intelligence officer, who looked at the same data and went very quiet. The defense grid was everywhere. Not concentrated at military installations, everywhere. Every orbital platform, civilian and military alike, had been fitted with weapons systems. The asteroid mining operations throughout the belt were emitting weapons signatures. The Jovian processing stations were armed. The lunar surface bristled with mass drivers of a scale that his intelligence reports had marked as theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. And that was before he looked at Earth itself. Threx Mora had fought in 2 wars before this one. He knew what a defended planet looked like. He had never, in his 40 years, seen anything like this. Every orbital slot was occupied. The defense network was not a shell around the planet. It was a density layers deep, with firing solutions that overlapped into something his tactical computer struggled to map, because it had not been built to model this many simultaneous engagement vectors. In the 30 seconds his fleet spent trying to understand what they were looking at, Earth began broadcasting. Not a military signal, not a targeting lock or a formal declaration of engagement. A broadcast, open on every frequency from the planet's surface, from billions of points on the planet's surface simultaneously. His communications officer patched it to the bridge with a look on her face that Threx Mora had never seen there before. Voices, billions of them, every human on Earth it seemed speaking at once, in every language saying the same thing. We are still here. Threx Mora had commanded warships for 40 years. He had felt fear before, the clean, functional fear that sharpens decision-making and keeps soldiers alive. What he felt in that moment was something different, something older, the kind of feeling that had no military application whatsoever. He thought about Scarathvel's resignation letter, the one that had circulated through the Dominion command structure and been dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of an intelligence analyst who had spent too long studying his subject. He thought about the line he had personally underlined and marked as overstated. You are not fighting a human military, you are fighting humanity itself. There is no distinction. He understood it now. He understood it with complete and terrible clarity as his tactical display lit up with engagement warnings from every direction simultaneously. Not just orbital installations, but the automated platforms he hadn't even cataloged yet, rising from positions throughout the system. A defense architecture that had been growing quietly for 11 months while his attention was on the front. The battle for Sol lasted 4 hours. Threx Mora survived it, barely, in a damaged escape pod that was retrieved by a compact observer vessel whose crew treated him with a careful, formal courtesy that he would spend a long time thinking about afterward. He lay in the medical bay of the compact ship and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand where his model had failed. He had been hunting a command structure, a nerve cluster, A capital to threaten, a leadership to eliminate, a symbol to destroy. He had pointed his fleet at a civilization of 200 billion people and expected to find a head. There was no head. There had never been a head. Humanity had spent 3 centuries since their last great civil conflict deliberately, methodically distributing their power, not out of military strategy, but out of politics, out of hard-won institutional memory about what happened when everything depended on one point of failure. They had built redundancy into their government, their industry, their military command, their supply chains, their communication networks, out of a deep civilizational trauma about centralized authority. In doing so, they had accidentally built something close to an indestructible warfighting organism. Threxmora closed his eyes and thought about his planet, his family, the empire that had stood for 400 years. He thought we should have left them alone. The Dominion High Command formally requested surrender terms 48 hours after the Battle of Saul. Admiral Torres received the message on the bridge of her flagship. She read it once, set it down, and began making arrangements. She was going to Vreth Prime personally. She had decided some time ago exactly how this was going to end, not with the terms she imposed, but with what she was going to make them do before she would hear a single word of surrender. The Dominion's capital chamber was built to intimidate. Torres had seen the architectural analyses, the high ceilings designed to make visitors feel small, the dais arrangement that placed Dominion leadership physically above any delegation they received, the particular quality of the light filtering through the crystalline roof that made the chamber feel cold and eternal and absolute. It was a room that had been carefully engineered to communicate one thing: you are here because we allow it. She walked in with 12 people and no weapons. The 3 remaining members of the Dominion High Command sat on the far side of the great table, diminished, exhausted, stripped of everything that had made them powerful. Their fleet was gone. Their fuel network was ruins. 7 of their 11 seat worlds had been isolated by human blockades. The compact observer mission stood in the gallery above, watching, and Torres was aware that every major civilization in the known galaxy was watching this broadcast. She sat down across from the High Command, set a document on the table between them, and said nothing. The senior surviving member, a being named Vrethun, who had been 3rd in command when the war began and was now the highest-ranking official left, looked at the document. It was 900 pages long. He looked back at Torres. "These are your terms." "No," Torres said. "That's what you're going to do before I give you my terms." She explained. Her voice was the same voice she used for staff briefings and fleet addresses, and the 11 hours she had spent listening to Dr. Osai read names over the remembrances intercom, level, clear, without performance. The document contained the complete census records of every world the Vreth Dominion had destroyed, absorbed, or diminished over 200 years of expansion. Every victim. Every name that the Compact's archivists had managed to preserve, and quite a few names recovered by human intelligence teams who had spent the last 6 months specifically assigned to finding records the Dominion had tried to erase. It ran to 61 worlds. The aggregate death count was not something Torres had memorized. She didn't need to. The number wasn't the point. The names were the point. She told them they would read every page aloud, on open broadcast, in their own language with compact translation running on all channels so that every species in the galaxy could hear it. Every name, every world, 200 years of erasure spoken back into existence by the people who had done the erasing. When she finished explaining, the chamber was very quiet. Vrethun stared at her for a long time. He was not a young being. He had served the Dominion for most of his life. She could see him trying to find the strategic angle, the concession he could offer instead, the reframing that would let them accept something less than this. There was no angle. She had not left one. "Why?" he asked finally. Not why the war, not why these terms, those he understood, something more fundamental. He was asking about the document, about the 900 pages, about the specific, peculiar things she was asking them to do. Torres considered the question. She had thought about it for a long time, in the shipyards of Mars, in the planning sessions, in the quiet hours after Dr. Osai finished reading, and the remembrance sat in silence with its 1,100 people who had just spent 31 hours carrying the names of the dead. She had thought about it, and she had arrived at an answer that was not tactical, not strategic, not the kind of thing that belonged in a military doctrine document. "Because someone has to remember them," she said, "and you're going to be the ones who do it." She didn't say, because forgetting is how this happens again. She didn't say, because 200 years of silence made you think you could erase people and there would be no cost. She didn't say, because the only thing worse than destroying the dead is making the galaxy act as if they were never alive. She didn't need to. She could see him understanding it. The broadcast ran for 31 hours. 3 members of the Dominion High Command read 900 pages of names into an open channel that reached every corner of the known galaxy. They read without stopping, rotating through the document in shifts, their voices sometimes steady and sometimes not. The compact observer mission watched from the gallery. The human guard detail stood at the walls. Not a single human ship moved during those 31 hours. Tors sat in the chamber for the first 3 hours, then moved to an antechamber, then walked the corridors of the Dominion Capitol building, then sat outside in the thin alien sunlight and listened to the broadcast through a small speaker she carried in her coat pocket. She listened to the Dominion High Command speak the names of the people they had destroyed, and she thought about a farming world around an orange star, and a university, and 4 hospitals, and a children's choir that had won a competition that nobody outside the colonial circuit had ever heard of. She thought about 2.1 million names. She thought about 61 worlds. She thought about all the things that had been alive and then weren't, and all the things that were still alive because of 31 hours of names being spoken into the void. When the broadcast ended, she went back inside and sat across from Vrethun, who looked like a being who had spent 31 hours having something fundamental about himself rearranged. She gave him the terms. They were harsh but survivable. The compact observers would later describe them as the most carefully calibrated surrender terms in the recorded history of interstellar conflict, punishing enough to mean something, measured enough to leave the Dominion's people with a civilization to rebuild. Vrethun signed without negotiation. Tors flew back to her flagship as the sun set on Vreth Prime, carrying a copy of the broadcast in her personal files. She would listen to it again, she knew, more than once. Not because she needed to. Because they deserved to be heard. 3 years later, a monument was raised on the glassified surface of what had been New Carthage, not by humanity, but by a delegation of Vreth civilians who had petitioned the Galactic Compact for permission to travel there. The monument bore no human inscription. It bore only names, all 2.1 million of them, carved into dark stone under an orange star. Around it, planted in the vitrified soil with technology donated quietly by 7 compact species, were the first seeds of a new atmosphere. Nobody had asked them to begin the terraforming. They had simply decided that the least they could do was try to make something grow again.